in the field.
Place in it. What are the real community dynamics here? Is it good to have renters? You know, is it good to have a mix? What would be our ideal?
Facilitating project development, interim financing for construction, even mortgage financing. The idea is to spread what little money there is around, getting social housing established by using public and private funding the most efficient way possible.
One time, the government would do it for people. You know, the government is going to do this for the people. They're going to provide housing. And that actually started to change in the 70s when the government withdrew from delivering the housing themselves and said, we're going to start dealing with co-ops and nonprofits and community-based organizations. We're now working with community groups, church groups, municipalities in delivering more units and sort of trying to take the government dollars and stretch them further.
Where the landlords are the only ones who seem to be gaining anything.
Advocacy, rent supplements, new construction. There are many ways BC Housing fulfills its mandate. But despite all the work, there still seems to be a stigma associated with social housing. People are leery about having social housing in their neighborhood. They're afraid of crime, afraid it will lower property values or make it difficult to park. And then there's the perception that taxpayers are subsidizing luxurious lifestyles. Expensive-looking buildings scare taxpayers. They see dollars, not homes. Some would prefer to subsidize people through rent supplements and shelter allowances because they think it must be cheaper. In fact, a recent study conducted by ECOS Research in Ottawa suggests otherwise.
What the ECOS study did was it addressed in an empirical way, looking at real numbers, a debate which has been going on in this country for 20 or 30 years, and which has gone on in the States for that amount of time. And it's, do you give people money in their hand and let them go into the market and find their own shelter within certain limits, or do you build housing for them? Because the real answer is you do both. Because some people have short-term problems and some people have long-term problems. Some markets have long-term problems and some have short-term problems.
The research team studied 20 pairs of buildings in BC, half of them non-profit and half private accommodation with rent supplements. Rents and prices were compared over a period of 20 years. The study found that while housing run by non-profit societies may be more expensive to begin with, social housing actually becomes more cost-effective within 5 to 10 years. In other words, in the long term, it costs taxpayers less to build new housing than it does to subsidize tenants living in the private market.
In addition, and the study didn't look at this, you're left with an asset base at the end. Non-profit housing is built to last at least 60 years. You're sitting in an asset which, when the mortgage is paid out in 35 years, you can refinance. And we already see that happening in the system.
At the end of the day, the province has an inventory of housing it can use over and over again, whereas through shelter allowances it simply becomes a transfer of public funds to private landlords, a band-aid solution to a permanent problem. That price tag of $780 million could be put to better use. Some of it could be used to build new housing. In fact, variety seems to be the key.
It is better for BC Housing to support the building of non-profit and cooperative housing, particularly in markets where there's a long-term housing problem. And in markets where there are short-term problems, it makes some sense to look at rent supplements or shelter allowances.
We try to prove that lack of equity isn't necessarily a character flaw, you know. Because you just don't have that equity, it means that you're, you know, oh, there's a renter down the hall. Well, I mean, most people who bought were renters at once, too.
Whether it's through advocacy, rent supplements, or building programs, social housing allows thousands of British Columbians to live with dignity and purpose. And good news from the taxpayer's point of view, all that work accounts for less than 1% of the annual provincial budget. This is Rosemary Green, a 38-unit townhouse complex in South Surrey. 75% of these homes are occupied by single-parent families. Building a housing complex primarily for single moms was a hard sell. Community opposition killed the first two potential locations, and this one materialized only because its supporters got the community on side. At their third request, Surrey City Council passed the motion for rezoning.
3 times by brothers. And then she finally settles for the one that's...
The complex opened in 1996, and Rupal Shankland and her 4 children were among the first to move in. 2 of her children still live at home in a warm and loving environment. The family is settled now, but things were tougher earlier on.
I like Brussels sprouts. I like healthy.
Vancouver, BC, it's a very expensive place to live. As a single parent, I didn't have a really good career before my marriage ended, so when it did end, I was really in quite a lot of trouble.
How did you cope with that?
Well, I tried to work. I mean, I did work, but I didn't have a lot of skills, so I went to secretarial school for a while, and I worked as a secretary for a few years. But I wasn't very good at it, and between the marriage ending and trying to look after the 4 children, eventually I was actually having a nervous breakdown. And my boss, after giving me 3 chances to stay at my job, finally did me a favor and fired me, which left me with no money and no job, but at least I could start to recover my life a little bit.
Right.
So that was a really close to the lowest point.
As soon as Rupal moved in, she was able to upgrade her skills, this time in an occupation that really interested her.
It was just really helpful to me to come here because I don't pay as much for rent. And I'm finally pursuing the career that had interested me for the last 10 years, which I never felt that I could do because I couldn't afford to go to school or to pay the rent, and look after the kids at the same time. But now I'm doing that. I'm doing the job that I like. I went to school for 2 years to become qualified as a massage therapist, and that's what I'm doing, and I'm making a living. I don't work really hard because physically it's quite demanding, but I'm making enough to get by for now, and I'm really enjoying my work. So.
So what's it like to live here?
Well, as you can see, it's quite an attractive complex. So it's nice to live in a place that's aesthetically pleasing. I mean, people had some concerns that it was affordable housing so that it wouldn't look as nice as the other houses in the neighborhood. But I think personally that the architect did a wonderful job. Chose beautiful colors, nice proportions of the buildings. And we have little gardens, and which is nice, much nicer than what you have in an apartment.
Stable, affordable housing has given Rupal a new outlook on life.
When there's too many stresses, people don't do well. And I've had a bit of experience with that, so I think I can say that.
For you before it got to the point where there were just too many things piled on you all at the same time?
Well, yes. Looking after kids, trying to work, not ever having quite enough money to pay all the bills, emotional impact of divorce. It can be a lot for people. It was a lot for me. I think the most important thing about this kind of housing is, given the way society is today and the number of kids that don't have intact families, that it's really important for the children. That their parents, for whatever reasons, if they can't afford your normal, wonderful suburban house or apartment, that they still should be given a chance.
So this is a non-profit housing complex. How long have you lived here?
About 6 years now.
And in that space of time, you've managed to organize a tenants' rights coalition or group?
Yep, a tenants' rights
Tina Suter is also a divorced young mother living in social housing. This non-profit complex is managed by the Burnaby Lions Club.
Yeah.
So what kinds of things have you accomplished?
We had a basketball hoop put in back over there for the teens, and recycling, a bulletin board with a cover on it so that the stuff didn't get snitched. And,
like Rupal Shankland in South Surrey, Tina faced a crisis before she moved in here. Single and the sole caretaker of a 1-year-old, Tina received the shock of her life after visiting her doctor.
I was diagnosed with a brain tumor one day. 3 days later, they did the surgery. So I had 2.5 days to plan a will, to plan what to do with my daughter. I was told I had a 50-50 chance of living or dying. If I lived, I'd be a vegetable.
The tumor was removed, but there were complications. Tina lost some of her peripheral vision, some of her memory. and she became dyslexic.
I had to relearn everything from scratch, and it was perfect that my daughter was a year old because we learned to go to the bathroom, to use a potty together at the same time. We learned to walk together.
So during this desperate time, did you ever just basically feel such a heavy load on your shoulders that you just couldn't take it anymore?
Never. Absolutely never. I looked into that little girl's bright blue eyes. That's what kept me going.
Mom, you want to go to the print shop today?
Print shop? Okay.
Print shop.
So you go to
here. See where it says PS Stocks?
Tina and little Stacy found themselves renting a succession of apartments. For a long time, they stayed in the bachelor suite Tina's mother lived in. All the while, they were eking out a living on Tina's disability pension. When BC Housing called to say her name had come to the top of the waiting list, Tina jumped at the chance to rebuild her life.
I was offered 2 units on the same day, one directly managed through BC Housing and one through a nonprofit housing society. I chose the nonprofit housing society.
She went back to school. She's now training to be a community social service worker and studies at home with the help of Stacy, who often reads textbooks to her. This year, Tina won a bursary from BC Housing.
The bursary was for $750, which covers this last semester right to the cent, which is just fantastic. And I qualified for it because I live in nonprofit BC Housing sponsored housing.
Okay. Yeah. So you didn't have to like write a paper or explain why you wanted to go to school, or?
You could. It was optional.
Oh, okay.
And I wrote a kick-butt paper, of course. And I assume that I was granted the bursary on the merit of that paper that I wrote.
Once you graduate, what do you think you and your daughter are going to be doing?
We have our future planned, actually. Once I graduate, my daughter and I will be moving to the Okanagan. I would like to work, hopefully, at the cancer agency that has recently been set up in Kelowna in the social work department. They have a wonderful social work department.
So you want to help people based on the knowledge you gained from the help that you didn't receive at the time.
Exactly.
There was just nothing there.
You got it. Falling through the cracks was the best thing that ever happened to me.
It isn't for everyone. Some people find the process of determining need on the basis of income and employability to be too intrusive, even downright invasive. And then there's the annual review process in which tenants must provide up-to-date income information and have their rents adjusted accordingly. Many also find the units small and Spartan, and tenants are paying rent. They're not building equity. Still, it's a start.
Bye for now. Hey, Mom. That was your other daughter. Oh, yeah? How's she doing?
There's a perception social housing is somehow housing of last resort, but it's not. Social housing is for people who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves with fewer options, or who have made a conscious decision to move into a particular development and become part of that community. Perhaps we've been swayed by the glossy real estate ads that tell us owning your own house is part of the Canadian dream. Perhaps we've bought into that traditional vision of suburban utopia. The reality, however, is that not everyone can own a house, or even wants to. Just like owning a home or renting an apartment, social housing contributes to the health and vibrancy of the larger community. For people like Anita Jack, Tina Suter, and Rupal Shanklin, affordable housing opens doors to opportunities. If you did not have access to this place, where do you think you would be?
I have no idea. I really don't know. On the street, probably.
Really?
Yeah, in a scooshed up, dirty little basement suite somewhere, or something that I could afford.